Tears turn to laughter, that child long ago. My soul starts to linger, it's home I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me alone to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam. Whenever I go,
Taking in a huge expanse that virtually extends from the lowlands of the St. Lawrence to the U.S. border, this region makes for an interesting study. It distinctively encapsulates the Canadian story. Social, cultural, and economic influences from our American neighbors, combined with the British-French connection, have played out on a stage, a terrain, a geography, if you will, that continues to be the dominating force. We'll devote 2 episodes of sketches to this subject. We'll uncover a village that caters to music and has no unemployment. We'll meet a foremost poet, a painter, and we'll experience the area with those who live it. So come along and join us on our tour of l'Estrie, the eastern townships of Quebec. The confluence of the St. Francis and the Magog rivers. In the French regime, it was a trading post called Grand Fourche, the Forks. Today, the city of Sherbrooke's 78,000 population moves to the rhythm of contemporary life. Another side to the region, a dominant side, which offers balance. The area of 13,100 square kilometers, which comprises the eastern townships, maintains an equilibrium between urban and rural living. Dairy farms and orchards are trademarks here. Agriculture has always held significance, and although farming may have changed, the land remains a major influence. Historian and professor Derek Booth.
One of the ways that I like to try to approach the study of the landscape with the students is to think of the landscape, and this works particularly well in the eastern townships, as a series of overlays that you begin with the idea of the physical environment as the basic starting point, as the bottom layer, as the empty stage. And then through time, at various sequences, people appear on that stage and create an overlay, create an economic and a cultural landscape. And then elements of that may disappear and a new landscape is created over the top of it.
Also a part of the setting, niche industries in remote places. Danielle Gervais.
We were dreaming of selling our guitars all over the world, and I think the dream came true right now. So all I dream about is to always keep up the quality, so our guitars will sell all over the world, and better, because it's not a problem to sell them right now. It's really to make them.
People pick strawberries in June and go and pick their own vegetables.
Extrapolating from the patterns of former generations is part of the teaching philosophy of Robin Burns.
What I emphasize is that one should not think of the history of the eastern townships in isolation. I often use the analogy of a scientist in his lab dissecting an insect. So I like to see the eastern townships as a kind of lab where one can examine under a microscope the human experience. And I try and relate as much as possible to the rest of Quebec, the rest of Canada, North America, and indeed the world.
Molded by retreating glaciers, lakes, rivers, mountains. After 1760, during British dominance, this was Buckinghamshire. The size of Switzerland, the territory as part of the Appalachian Range, rises in areas to a panoramic 1,000 meters. As a painter, Kay Kinsman likes to depict society within this setting.
I find that it's very rich and interesting, lovable, and sometimes not so lovable personalities. I think that Stephen Leacock would have adored it.
Some townshippers share backyards with American neighbors. The town of Rock Island is an example.
We're literally on the Canadian, United States and Canada line. In fact, the Opera House here, which is right across the street from my house, the Canadian line goes right through the center of the Opera House. Half of it's in the US and half of it's in Canada. The yard over there is split by the United States and Canada line. So you can literally throw a rock into Canada.
Si on regarde une carte de la province de Québec, la région des Eastern Townships...
If one looks at a map of the province of Quebec, the region of the Eastern Townships is north of Vermont. I often explain that this region, at the beginning of the 19th century, was a second Vermont.
The townships of Jean-Pierre Kesteman, home for Marjorie Goodfellow.
I was brought up on a farm and studied history at Bishop's University, became a librarian, and worked for a time away from the townships. But then the pull became too strong and I had to come back home. Of course, the very first people here were the Abenaki Indians, and they had already used the waters extensively, camped on the banks of the St. Francis River, particularly in this area.
Of the earliest non-native depictions, these illustrations, which captured the imagination of the Old World, were done by William Bartlett in 1836. He was taken with the paysage, a terrain whose insularity was considered an asset.
None of the rivers which drains from the eastern townships into the St. Lawrence is navigable over any considerable distance for any substantial size of craft. And this was a region which had been purposely kept empty of settlement after the conquest. Until 1791, the idea was to keep the region empty as a sort of buffer zone between French Canada and the newly independent states, the United States of America.
Ironically enough, with a change of political view, this once buffer zone began by 1791 to be shaped by that same population to the south.
Here, they date back to the 18th century. Have any of you met Edson Warner? Quite a character about the campus and about town. He's very well read. He claims that his ancestor, Seth Warner, is buried here. And Seth was a member of the Green Mountain Boys who invaded Quebec in 1775, along with Benedict Arnold and Richard Montgomery.
But the people who actually cleared the land and settled were ordinary American farmers and pioneers from New England. And they came, and it might be surprising for us today to understand this, but as a kind of a tax revolt. Vermont just joined the Union as the 14th state. As a result, Vermont taxpayers had to bear a share of the huge American public debt. And here, at the same time, they were advertising free Crown land north of the 45th parallel, and naturally, many found it difficult to resist.
In the southern portions of the eastern townships, where the New England population concentration was greatest, there were road links of a sort, and for much of the early period of the 19th century, it was easier to travel south to Boston than it was to travel to Quebec City or to Three Rivers or to Montreal.
That's typical American New England architecture. I think we can take a look through the window and get an idea of how plain and simple it was. Okay, plain wooden benches, no stained glass. There is a organ, and it's why architecturally this part of the Eastern Townships is really culturally a part of New England. You would not be able to tell in terms of architecture that you've actually crossed the border.
These people were knowledgeable shipbuilders, and if you look at the clapboard on the sides of these buildings, it's just the opposite pattern of when they build ships. It's done this way to keep the water out when you're sailing on top. It's done the opposite way to keep the rain out. And in many ways, if you look at that style of building as an inverted ship, you get, I think, a better appreciation of New England architecture and Eastern Townships architecture. American churches were better acclimatized to conditions in the townships. All you needed was a preacher on horseback with a Bible in a saddlebag, okay, and a place to preach. And so the Methodists were quite good at servicing these communities.
And signposts that distinguish the place.
Cedar fence rails, lines of old maple trees along a country road, isolated country churches, farmhouses tucked away in the woods by themselves. Many of these, too, are images that come very readily to mind, and I think form part of townshippers' perception of their region.
There is a reverence, a holiness that exudes from this land. Here, the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Benoît-du-Lac offers solace to over 7,000 pilgrims and visitors a year. People seeking pause from the pressures of modern-day society. Here also, words as a musical language take on new meaning. Poetry. Ralph Gustafson is a master at it.
I find that in my own work, the lyricism of the place, out of the geographical beauty, is utilized. And I find that meaning is what I absorbed and was conditioned by my early life right here in this spot. Glittering with sun as the wind moved were all the leaves of the tree. It was a concordance between heaven and the earth. Below, evening fell, no shadow, but a deepening green. Birds came and went. The time seemed holy, though there was no proof. The leaves trembled in the sun, and the tall green was standing from some force. The birds sang for some reason. It was clear something was at work, not only sensation.
An awful lot of the houses are done in the same pattern that was very, very popular back about the early 20s, I think. The four windows, the door in the middle, and the one little attic window up at the top. You see that repeated over and over and over. And then you have the more pompous houses that belong to the sort of the wealthy bourgeoisie back at the turn of the century, when everyone had to have a turret. And it just stuck them on. And in some places you can't even get into the turret. It's just a thing that you bought, a mail order catalog. I want a turret type A or B or C or something like that, and then you got the local carpenter to stick it on with a Velcro or something. I don't know. And in some cases, very funny. There's one house, whose name I won't mention, they haven't even stuck it on right. It's sort of kitty-cornered, and it delights me every time I go past.
An anomaly. La Patrie, a village of 340, far from everything, and everyone has a job. Furthermore, one of the main industries caters to the international music scene.
We have two plants. In our first plant, we make electric guitars and semi-acoustic guitars. And this plant here, we make mostly or mainly acoustic guitars. What is very important in an acoustic guitar is the wood that you're going to use to make it. We use cedar or spruce tops. They come from British Columbia. We are lucky. We have the best wood in the world to make acoustic guitars. You'll see big blocks of wood. They come from trees that are never under 300 years old. What is nice about the people from La Patrie and the people from a little village around, because we hire a lot of people from the little towns around, is that they know wood. You know, they were born and they were born and raised in an environment. People that know wood, you know, they know how to deal with wood. They know what the wood is going to do when it's going to dry. You know, when it's a living thing. You know, that they know by heart. And when they work wood, it's nothing new for them.
Human ability, motivated by capitalism, coupled to natural heritage. With a greater influx from the U.S., industry began to take hold here by the time of the American Civil War, and with it came change.
We're now on the Ascot River, and we're in Ascot Township, the township, one of the original ones of 1792, which was ceded to Gilbert Hyatt. In terms of the patterns which the Americans brought, in terms of their developments, very, very different from the British.
And one of the first things a good entrepreneur looked for was water power. Water power to power a grist mill, a sawmill, and quite often would select a homestead on that particular basis. I'm always impressed with the ingenuity, and I can only attribute that to kind of a Yankee inventiveness.
The economic boom in agriculture, benefiting from huge markets to the south, became the catalyst for development. Soon enterprise began to shape the social order.
Et c'est cet argent qui va venir de l'agriculture qui va aider des hommes d'affaires.
This money that came from agriculture helped the business community to establish factories and railways.
C'est intéressant parce qu'on voit que la proximité avec la Nouvelle-Angleterre.
What's interesting is that the proximity of New England encouraged the entrepreneurial spirit in the townships.
De businessmen qui ont, je dirais, l'esprit d'entrepreneur. Et on peut le voir encore aujourd'hui en se promenant.
We can see today by touring the villages.
Bon, comme Georgieville, comme Stansted, Rock Island, comme Quaticook, comme Magog, il y en a des dizaines de petits villages où on voit les belles maisons.
There are dozens of places where examples can be seen of the same architectural styles of Vermont and New Hampshire.
Que les maisons du Vermont ou du New Hampshire.
The longest suspension footbridge in the world, across the gorge of the Quaticook River, is a landmark for the town of the same name. Begun in 1818, Quaticook's history exemplifies the growth pattern of many places in S3. By the mid-19th century, invention and proximity to American markets had given rise to a diverse manufacturing base. The common denominator that saw manufacturing flourish throughout the region and witnessed Sherbrooke's rise to the status of Queen City, water power.
Gilbert Hyatt is credited with having installed the first mill on the banks of the St. Francis River, just where the Magog River joins it. And the Magog comes tumbling down through the rocky gorges and goes through some magnificent scenery.
Alors, le destin de Sherbrooke, c'est un destin vraiment manufacturier, industriel. En 1844,
Sherbrooke's destiny was manufacturing, industry.
avec du capital, de l'argent régional, sherbrookois.
It was in 1844 that local businessmen with investment from the region began the Sherbrooke Cotton Factory. This was the first of its kind in all of the country.
Et c'est très intéressant parce que ils fournissent le capital et ils vont chercher.
It's very interesting because they supply the capital, yet they go to New England, to the Boston area, for the know-how and machinery to get the factory rolling.
Spécialistes pour faire tourner le moulin de coton. Vers 1850, la ville de Sherbrooke compte 500 habitants.
Around 1850, Sherbrooke's population was 500. It was more of a large village than a city. But 10 years later, with the arrival of the railways and the development of industry, it's a city of 3,000 people.
In February of 1843, a group of townshippers met here in Sherbrooke to discuss the potential of a railway connecting the area to markets in the north and the Atlantic seaboard to the south. A decade later, transformation.
It was only after 1853 when the first railway line ran through the heart of the Eastern Townships, joining Montreal with Portland, Maine, that symbolically at least the isolation of the region was broken.
All of a sudden, new markets being available, being able to travel. There's a remarkable letter from a member of the Stacy family who came over from Great Britain, describing the party which was held in Sherbrooke at the opening of the station. And I calculate that there was probably twice as many people at that particular party as lived in Sherbrooke. It was the Expo 67, the landing on the moon, okay, for the Eastern Townships. It would really put the townships on the map.
And so we stand today at the end of a long progression, a long series of the creation of a series of overlays like this. And yet, within the landscapes of the townships, you can still find remnants of just about every one of the earlier stages, going right back in some cases to just about the initial settlement.
Next week, we'll trace the story of how the world's first international railway would signify the end of one era of influence and the birth of another. Join us for part 2 as we focus on Estrie, the Eastern Townships of Quebec.